From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
There are more than 1.5 million home invasions per year in the United States. Within that number, there are less than a few hundred that are actual kidnappings. And even though that number is small, I cannot imagine how terrifying that would be. One moment, you're fast asleep, and the next, there's a stranger in your home taking you hostage. It's a violation of your personal space, a shattering of the illusion that your home is a safe place. That thought is terrifying. Now imagine the invader is something you've never seen before. Something with technology beyond anything you've ever seen to the extent that it seems almost like magic. Something that looks humanish, but there's something off about its proportions, its features. Too short. The head is a little too large, the eyes are enormous, the skin is a little too gray. You're also no longer in your bedroom, but rather in a strange little room with bright lights and what appears to be medical instruments. And no matter how hard you try, you cannot move. This is a thing of nightmares, and yet one study has found that around 1,700 or even as many as 5 to 6% of the general population claim to have had the same or similar experience. I know what you're thinking, this sounds absolutely insane. It sounds too improbable to be true, and yet renowned Harvard psychiatrist John Mack did a study back in the early 1990s of 200 men and women who reported such experiences. Though Mack never went as far as to say that these were alien encounters, he did admit that he was at a loss for answers and that the people studied experienced something powerful and compelling and that it deserved further study. For this week's episode, I welcome back author Warren Agius, who talks about his brand new book, Close Encounters, Exploring the Mysteries of Alien Abductions. Welcome to this week's mystery, Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, Alien Abductions, on From the Void. All right, Warren, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming back on again.
Thank you for having me, John. It's an absolute pleasure. I really love the show.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, really appreciate you coming back on. First of all, I always recommend your last book to folks who are enthusiastic about the subject matter, but maybe don't know some of the basics and some of the better, stronger cases out there. So, absolutely fantastic book. The new one, likewise. So, whereas the first one sort of like covers like some of the more, I think, solid UFO cases of sightings, this one goes a little bit deeper. So talk a little bit about what kind of prompted you to write this book.
Of course. First of all, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate it. So like you said, the first book, Evidence of Extraterrestrials, it focuses more on UFO sightings, especially those made by military personnel. And in that book, I've only focused on the most compelling UFO sightings. And I simply asked the question, are we alone? So the first book focuses on trying to solve and answer that question, whether we are alone or not. And by presenting a number of significant and compelling cases, the conclusion becomes that we are absolutely not alone. Not only that, but we are also being visited by these advanced non-human entities. But then obviously the phenomenon is very complex and the question does not end there. Then I started asking myself sort of, what is the reason behind these visitations? And as I was writing the first book, I realized that there was a more interesting phenomenon that I wanted to explore, which is alien abductions. And that is how the second book sort of came around. But as I was writing the second book and gathering research and material, I realized that there are more hoaxes than there are genuine cases. So in the book, if I cover 15 cases, there's a large portion of cases which are clearly a hoax. For instance, cases like Billy Meyer and George Adamski. These are cases which I do not mention in the book. I wanted the second book, which I named Close Encounters, to focus on the most compelling and the most convincing alien abduction cases out there. So, of course, I always say this, but the easiest part about writing a book is actually writing it. The hard part of it is gathering the research and finding which cases are genuine and which cases are compelling. And that was quite a difficulty because there are so many cases out there which are clearly a hoax, which are clearly an attempt for the individual to gain fame or money.
Yeah, and not only that, but when you're talking about an abduction versus just a sighting, oftentimes sightings, like you've got cases like the Phoenix Lights,
Yeah,
where you've got hundreds upon hundreds of
exactly.
So it becomes more compelling versus an abduction scenario, which is oftentimes a very individual.
Yeah, 100%. And like you're saying, sometimes, for instance, in the first book, I note that many UFO sightings, they show up on radar, and that is data that cannot be disputed. Like if a UFO shows up on radar, you cannot say no, it did not, because it's there, right? But with an alien abduction, like you said, it's very individualistic. So it is quite challenging to see whether a case is genuine or not. And as a matter of fact, writing the book, there's like two sides to it, right? The first part is the storytelling, and you need to, well, I made sure to write the case in a way that not only is accurate, and I made sure not to exaggerate any of the details, but I also wanted to make it engaging and write it in a way that keeps the reader engaged. But I specifically wrote it in a way not to exaggerate any of the details, because that immediately would make it a fictional book, and it's a non-fiction book. But apart from that, the other part of writing the chapter is looking at the evidence, and that is something that I stress throughout the writing of the book. Where is the evidence? And that's an absolutely pivotal part, and it's an absolutely important part of deciphering whether an alien abduction case is genuine or not.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about your work is your attention to detail and the fact that you're looking at facts and letting the facts speak for themselves. And you do such a great job of sort of laying out sort of this list of criteria that are pretty common throughout these abductions. But and we'll definitely get there. Before we get there, though, you really do a great job of laying the groundwork in the introduction, where you talk about a couple different potential implications. Even acknowledging that this could potentially be legitimate. And so talk about those two different implications that you kind of discussed at the beginning.
Definitely. So like I said, I view the two books as working in conjunction with each other. So in the first book, the big question was, are we alone? And what is the evidence that shows that we are not alone? And through a series of cases, there's evidence that we are not alone. But then in the second book, these two premises and these two implications are put forward. So the first one is, if we're saying that alien abductions happen, if we're saying that these UFO sightings are real and UFOs are real, that means that there is an intelligent, conscious, non-human entity that is visiting our planet. That is the first implication. By saying that these UFO sightings are real, that means that there is a conscious, non-human entity that is visiting our Earth. Secondly, if we're saying that there is a non-human entity visiting our planet, that means that interstellar travel is possible. Otherwise, it would not be extraterrestrial in origin. So these are the two implications, and they follow of the simple statement that we are not alone, and these beings are visiting us. So to simplify it in a way, if we're saying that aliens exist and UFO sightings are real, then that automatically implicates that there is an advanced and conscious entity that is visiting our planet, and that interstellar travel is something which we thought was impossible is most certainly possible.
Absolutely. So kind of leading into the book, talk about, first of all, give a brief kind of synopsis of who J. Allen Hynek was, and then ultimately his UFO classification scale.
Yeah, definitely. So J. Allen Hynek, he's one of the most well-known UFO researchers, but more importantly than that, he's an advisor, or rather he was an advisor for the Air Force, and he worked on projects such as Project Blue Book, Project Sign, Project Grudge, to name a few. So he was a really important person out there, especially in the days of Project Blue Book and Project Sign, He's also an important individual because he was a complete skeptic at first. So he did not approach the subject with any biases. And I feel like that's very important, to approach the phenomenon with a skeptical eye. And in his research, he put forward a scale, and this is known as the Hynek UFO classification scale. And what this is that it outlines the different levels of UFO sightings. And the higher you go on the scale, the closer you get to the aircraft and to the occupants. So, for instance, if we look at the first level is known as nocturnal lights. And it's simply described as an individual seeing bright lights in the sky. There isn't any detail apart from the fact that you're seeing unidentified bright lights in the sky. The second level is known as the daylight discs. And this is where the detail starts coming, increasing. For instance, in this level, this involves reports which are made in the daytime, and the individual reports seeing a disc-shaped aircraft. So we're already seeing the detail slowly increasing. And this is followed by the third level, which is the radar visual level. And this is when there is a visual as well as a radar sighting. This means that the individual is seeing a UFO, an unidentified aircraft, and this same aircraft is showing up on radar. And from the third level onwards, there is greater detail. But what is important is that when an aircraft shows up on radar, then that means the case immediately becomes more significant. It immediately becomes more compelling and convincing. This brings us to the fourth level, which is close encounter of the first kind. And this is where the individual's UFO sighting is in close proximity to the point that the individual can describe the aircraft in greater detail. And many times the aircraft is described as being disc-shaped with a dome structure on top, silver in color with these equidistant portholes. Some even described lights being emitted from the disc. And then in the fifth level, which is close encounters of the second kind, is where I start. The cases included in the fifth level is the cases I start describing in the book. And the reason being is that close encounters of the second kind include cases where the individual is in such close proximity that they experience immediate and intermediate after effects. What this means is that the individual starts experiencing ailments because of their encounter. And throughout the chapters of the book, I described how the individual who experiences this close encounter, they not only experience physiological symptoms, but also psychological symptoms. And interestingly enough, the DIA published a paper not that long ago exploring the immediate, intermediate after effects which military personnel experienced when they were out on duty and they experienced a UFO. But going back to Hynek's scale, level 6 includes close encounters of the third kind. And this is probably where people start thinking about the movie of the same name. And close encounters of the third kind is where the individual is in close proximity, but they also witness an occupant. Now, throughout the book and throughout this podcast, I'll be using some terms interchangeably. For instance, occupant, I will also use the term non-human entity and also alien, but I try to refrain from using the latter word. So, as I was saying, close encounters of the third kind is when the individual sees a UFO and they're in such close proximity that they see the occupant. But at this point, there isn't an abduction. That is where close encounters of the fourth kind come in. And close encounters of the fourth kind is when the individual is abducted by this extraterrestrial entity. So if I had to sort of summarize it in the first book, which focuses on UFO sightings, I mostly cover from level 1 until the fifth level. I include a few cases of close encounters of the third kind. But this book, the second book, Close Encounters, I focus extensively on alien abductions and close encounters of the third kind.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the fact that you do cover a couple of the close encounters of the third kind, and I don't want to dig into all of them because I want the folks to go ahead and grab the book because it's amazing. But I do think it's important to touch on one in particular that I always found fascinating because, and by the way, again, you did an amazing job of this in the first book as well, where I think you and I both probably would agree that, instances where there are either sightings or experiences that occur where the witness is of a particular background.
Yeah.
Whether it be military background or law enforcement or, airline pilots, people who are trained to know the difference between a bird.
Exactly.
Are always incredibly compelling. So talk a little bit about the Socorro landing. When did this occur and where, and why was this event such a big deal based on who the witness was and what he did?
And that's spot on. Like you're saying, when an individual has a certain background, it immediately makes the case more compelling. And the reason being is that individuals who work in law enforcement, or they're pilots, or they work with the Air Force, they are specifically trained to be great observers. So for instance, if an individual who is not trained in observing, if I have a UFO sighting and I compare that to a police officer who has UFO sighting, the police officer's UFO sighting is immediately deemed more credible because they are trained in being great observers. And now we'll be talking a little bit about the Socorro incident. This case took place in New Mexico back in 1964 by an individual named Lonnie Zamora. And as we're saying, Lonnie Zamora was a sergeant police officer, and he was a very reputable individual. As a matter of fact, his great reputation is what made this case so compelling and so convincing. What happened was, it was 24th of April, 1964, and Zamora was out on duty. He was chasing a police car, a reckless driver. But suddenly, as he was driving, he saw this bright flame coming from a dynamite shack. And obviously, since there was a large flame coming from a dynamite shack, he thought that an explosion had taken place. As a matter of fact, just before he saw the bright flame, he heard a loud explosion. So he thought, okay, there was an explosion. So he started driving towards that direction. The case gets more interesting as he gets closer. He sees this silver object. And at no point thus far does he think that it's a UFO. He simply thinks that a car overturned, hence the silver object. And he also saw two beings next to the silver object, which he thought were the driver and the passenger. So he started driving closer to their direction to help them. But as he got closer, he realized that this was not a car, and those were certainly not human beings. What I mean by that is that as he drove closer, he saw an oval-shaped aircraft resting on the ground, and on the surface was this red insignia. And it's always difficult to describe what this insignia looked like, but the best I can describe it is it's like an inverted letter V with three lines running across it. And for the listeners out there, I encourage them to Google Lonnie Zamora UFO to sort of see what I'm talking about. So there's this oval-shaped aircraft, which is most definitely not a vehicle, and it's most definitely not a helicopter because it does not have any rotors. What's interesting is that the two individuals he saw beside it, he described them as being small adults. And at one point, they were unaware of his presence, but at one point, when they do see him, they become sort of startled. And as they become startled, they dash in this aircraft, this oval-shaped aircraft, and it starts hovering once again. At this point, Lonnie Zamora, he starts hearing this frequency, which is getting more intense, and he's also seeing this massive flame coming from beneath the aircraft, and he assumes that there's going to be an explosion at any point. So he starts running back to his vehicle but he trips on the floor. And as he looks, he looks out and he sees this aircraft hovering. It disappears almost instantly. So the sighting lasted a couple of minutes, and then he goes back to his vehicle. He calls his colleagues, and they go by the dynamite shack, and they immediately see depressions on the ground. And inside these depressions, they see burned grass. From there on, they immediately make a report. And that same afternoon, an FBI agent visits the landing site, and he interviews Zamora, and he immediately states that Zamora is a reputable individual and that he had no intention of creating such a story. He was also completely sober at the time of the incident, so you cannot say that he was under the influence of any substance. And the officer, he examines the landing site, and he sees these depressions, and they were a couple of inches deep and a couple of inches wide, and they were also equidistant from each other. And then the report gets forwarded to Project Blue Book, and the first explanation they think of is, could this have been a helicopter? But it could not have been a helicopter, obviously, because it did not, the description did not match that of a helicopter at all. Most obviously that there were no rotors on it. Apart from that, they also checked with the Air Force bases nearby, and they confirmed with their radar that there were no helicopters in the area. The next possibility was that could this have been a lunar surveyor? And the lunar surveyor, for the listeners out there, is basically, you have to keep in mind that the sighting took place back when they were sort of exploring the moon landings. So there was this aircraft known as the lunar surveyor, and it was practically used to practice safely landing on the surface of the moon. But they also confirmed the Air Force bases, and they confirmed that it was not the lunar surveyor. This leaves us with the other possibilities that could this have been a hoax. But both the FBI, both the Air Force knew that Lonnie Zamora was a reputable individual, that he had no intentions of creating a hoax, and he was not known to be into the UFO phenomenon, so there were absolutely no reasons as to why he would create a hoax. This leaves us with the only conclusion, the only hypothesis left, which is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And in the book, I pose the question, is it possible that what Lonnie Zamora described is the truth? And is it possible that he did indeed saw a UFO, and the two small human beings he saw were, and the occupants of the oval-shaped aircraft were extraterrestrial in origin? And this case is one of the few cases. It's one of the 700 cases which not even Project Blue Book could say it was a weather balloon or it was a natural weather phenomenon. No, Project Blue Book concluded that they had no idea what the aircraft was. They had no idea who the occupants were. And for this reason, the case is still unresolved. And Project Blue Book actually state in their report that this is the best documented case they had on the record.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, it's not the typical scenario where someone sights a UFO, miles in the distance and gets sort of a blurry photo. It's just a situation where someone's in very close proximity and can make out fine details, which makes it so interesting.
Indeed. And here we have, a sergeant police officer who has no reason as to why he should create a hoax. For instance, later in the book, I write about, Travis Walton and Whitley Strieber. And these are two individuals who I obviously respect a lot, and I respect their story, but you could see how they could potentially have a reason as to why they could create a hoax. But, Lonnie Zamora certainly did not have any reasons why, he could come up with a story. He had nothing to gain from it. And apart from that, he did not gain anything from it at all. As a matter of fact, he didn't write any books about it. The case is not very well known either. So, it's genuinely one of the cases where it is so convincing that I can't see any other hypotheses being credible apart from the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly. One of the other really interesting, so apart from obviously, where we've talked about, the credibility of witnesses based on, what they do for a living, that sort of thing. The other scenario that I find intriguing are the ones where, as I mentioned earlier, where there's a ton of different witnesses and something in close proximity. And one of the ones that you talk about, I think that's really interesting. And by the way, I want to make the point also that, being from the US, we talk a lot about UFO instances within the United States, but a lot of the ones in your book are from all over the planet. They're happening everywhere. And one of the interesting ones that you talk about is the aerial school landing.
Exactly. Yeah.
That one's fascinating. Yeah. Talk about that a little bit.
And as you said, many people, say, why do UFOs only land in the US? But that's not true at all. The aerial school sighting, it happened in Africa. And I'll get to that in a minute, but I also include a UFO landing which took place in France. So do you know anyone out there who thinks that the phenomenon only takes place in the United States? That's not necessarily true. The only reason that we hear more about it is that there's more publicity, there's more resources there. But going back to the aerial school sighting, this is a sighting which has 62 eyewitnesses. It's one of the most compelling, one of the most credible and fascinating cases out there. The case took place not that long ago, in 1994, in Rua, Zimbabwe. And for the listeners out there, I'm sure that, when we say Zimbabwe, people may think that we're talking about individuals who may not necessarily have a lot of resources, the children who may not be well educated, but that is simply a misconception. The case took place at Aerial School, which is an independent and private school. There were children of different cultures, different races. So it was, the children there came from an upper class family. So the case took place in September of 94, in the middle of September. And prior to that, there was what is known as a UFO flap. And what that means is that many people report seeing UFOs in the sky. But the case took place on the 16th of September. It was around 10 o'clock when the children were having their lunch break. So we had the teachers in the school during their meeting, and you had the children outside playing. At around 10 o'clock in the morning, a few of the children report seeing two disc-shaped aircrafts. At first, they describe them as being bright lights, but the closer they get, they realize that there are multiple UFOs. And when I say multiple, I mean there are more than two. But what happens is most of the UFOs, all of them, they instantaneously accelerate away, apart from one of the aircraft, which slowly and silently lands in this field, which is adjacent to the school field. So basically, you have the children playing in the field, and by the school playground, there is this other field where the UFO lands. A few of the children obviously they become hesitant, they become wary of the sighting, and they get scared, so they run away. But then there's also this portion of children who are intrigued by what they are seeing, and they stay. They see the event unfold. And the incident did not end there at all. After the UFO landed, many of the children report seeing two occupants beside the aircraft. And at first, this is all we know. All we know is that after a few minutes, these occupants go back into their aircraft and it accelerates out of sight. So the lost thing took place for a few minutes. And obviously, after an event like this, the children start talking about it. They mention it to their teachers. But, children and they have a great imagination. So the teachers just presume that this is simply a byproduct of their imagination. But what happens is that as the children go home and they start telling their parents, the parents start inquiring with the teachers and they start telling them, listen, you know what happened? And as the word spreads, the story even reaches the BBC. A reporter known as Tim Leach, he picks up on the story. So on Monday, Colin, who is the principal, actually, let me take it a step back. During the weekend, Cynthia Hind, who is one of the principal researchers UFO principal researchers from MUFON, she speaks to the principal and she tells him, listen, we're aware that, the children saw UFO. So what you need to do is that you need to gather them in one room and ask them to draw what they saw. So that's what Colin does. On Monday morning, he gathers the children in one classroom and he asks them to draw what they had seen the previous Friday. As I was writing this book, I looked at these 60 drawings. There's probably more than 60 drawings, and they're all so fascinating because they're all so very different, but they also include the same details. And what that means is that if all 60 drawings were identical, that means that they were imitating something. But the fact that they are original drawings and they're different, that means that the children truly drew what they had seen. So that same Monday, Tim Leach from the BBC, he visits Ariel School and he interviews 3 of the children, as well as the headmaster. And the first thing that he asks them is obviously, what happened on Friday. And the children tell him that they saw what they describe as people. One of the children, Kaylee, she describes the people as being white. I'm quoting her here, and she says there was a white one, a weird one, and a black one, and the black one was sitting on the spaceship. End quote. So she immediately, the children immediately thought to themselves that these occupants are certainly not human beings, and the aircraft they saw was certainly not a terrestrial aircraft. Otherwise, she would not have used the word spaceship. And obviously, Leach, he probes further, and he immediately probes and says, he asks them, why do you think it was a spaceship and not an aircraft? And the children describe the aircraft in great detail. They describe it as being a disc shape, and it was silver. And they also describe the occupants. And so that was Tim Leach's interview. And then after a few weeks, after a few months, the case actually becomes even more intriguing. And the reason being is that John Mack, who is a well-renowned psychiatrist, he visits the school and he interviews a group of children once again. This time, a new detail emerges, and the detail being that the occupants telepathically communicated with the children, and the occupants told the children that we are eradicating Tenet's natural resources and that we must take better care of our planet. And for the listeners out there, this telepathic message is very common across the majority of alien abduction cases. Many abductees report that they received telepathic messages from the beings telling them that we must take greater care of our planet. For instance, Whitley Strieber, he stated that he received a telepathic image and he was seeing natural disasters. So what the children stated, it lines up with what other abductees described as well. What is interesting about this case is obviously the fact that there are 62 eyewitnesses. And at the end of the chapter, I bring up my criticism of the case. And the only criticism I could think of was Cynthia Hines' involvement in the case. So just a little bit of background, as I stated earlier, Cynthia Hines, she's a MUFON investigator. And MUFON is an organization which investigates UFOs, basically. But what Cynthia Hines did was that she was pretty involved in the case. But at one point, she even told the children that the case is so big, so compelling that even America is interested in the case. So I told myself, like, if I was a child, if I was in their shoes and I heard, this stranger telling me that there's people on the other side of the world interested in the story, would I exaggerate what I had seen? But then, this question also does not hold up for the simple reason that the children described seeing the UFO, they described seeing the alien beings before Cynthia was actually involved. So the children gave their description and their statements on Monday morning, and Cynthia met with the children on Tuesday. the following day. So my criticism does not really hold up for that fact. The other hypothesis I could think of was that could this have been a prank? But even if it had been a prank, sort of impossible for anyone, first of all, to have an aircraft which disappears in a matter of seconds. Apart from that, it doesn't explain what the occupants were. And this leaves us with the third hypothesis, which is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Could it be the case that the children were being truthful? Could it be the case that, this is not a byproduct of their imagination? And the reason I believe this case to be genuine is, multiple decades later, their story has not changed at all. If it had been a prank, if the children had come up with such a story, I would assume that, 20 years later, over 20 years later, someone would come out and say it did not happen. It was all fake. But surprisingly, no one did do that. And to this day, their story, it's still identical to what they said back in 1994.
Thank you for listening to From the Void. If you enjoyed this episode or any of the previous episodes, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing, and sharing with a friend. We'll be back next week with the conclusion of my interview with author Warren Agius. So until then, I've been your host, John Williamson, and you've been listening to From the Void.